The library at Stirling Manor was not a room for reading. It was a room for forgetting. The air was thick with the scent of decaying parchment and the cold, unyielding smell of beeswax that failed to mask the damp rot in the corners. Clara Sterling slipped through the heavy mahogany doors, her breath hitching in a throat tightened by a sudden, sharp desperation. Behind her, the hallway echoed with the sound of Lord Percival Vane's voice, a sound like grinding gravel, oily and self-assured. He was looking for her. He was looking for the payment her father had promised to settle a debt of honor that honor had never touched. Clara did not move toward the shelves. Instead, she pressed herself into the shadows behind the heavy velvet curtains of the west window, her fingers clutching the one object that gave her a sense of gravity in a world trying to cast her adrift, her ink-stained ledger. It was a scrupulous record, a sanctuary of arithmetic where numbers never lied, even when her father and stepmother did. She closed her eyes and began to count. 1, 2, 3, the rhythmic intervals of footsteps in the corridor. 4, 5, the silence that followed. She regulated her pulse by the steady, predictable progression of digits, a silent prayer to the god of balance sheets. "He will not look here," she whispered to the darkness, her voice barely a thread. "He does not know the value of a book, let alone a room filled with them." But the library was not empty. A slight shift in the air, a movement of shadows near the hearth, made her heart staccato against her ribs. A man sat in the high-backed wing chair, his presence so still he seemed a part of the architecture itself. He had been watching her, not with the predatory hunger of Percival Vane, but with the cool, detached observation of a scholar examining a rare bruised specimen. He was a tall man, his frame draped in a coat the color of a winter storm, and his eyes were the precise gray of a sky that had not decided whether to clear or to rain. He had worn his grief like weather for 7 years. This she knew by reputation alone, for this was Sebastian Thorne, the Duke of Thorne, a man whose silence was said to have teeth. He did not rise. He did not call out. He simply watched as she stood there, a small, resolute figure with ink-darkened fingertips and a spine as straight as a column of figures. The silence between them stretched, thick and heavy, until the Duke leaned forward, the light of the dying fire catching the sharp line of his jaw. "The door is closed, Miss Penhaligon," he said, his voice a low, melodic baritone that seemed to vibrate in the very bones of the room. "The hunter has passed the thicket. Perhaps you might tell me who precisely you are running from." Clara did not startle. To startle was to lose the meager territory of her own dignity. Instead, she stepped out from the velvet shroud, her gaze meeting the Duke's with a levelness that few women of her station would dare. She saw the exhaustion in his face, the hollowed weariness of a man who had lived in a mausoleum of his own making, and she felt a sudden, inexplicable surge of kinship. They were both ghosts in this house. "I am running from a calculation that does not add up, Your Grace," she replied, her voice gaining strength. "A debt that is being paid in the wrong currency." Before he could respond, the heavy doors groaned open, and the sanctuary was breached. Lady Honoria Sterling swept into the room, her silk gown hissing against the floorboards like a snake in the dry grass. She did not look at the Duke first. Her eyes sought out Clara with a sharp, glittering malice. Behind her, Sir Arthur Sterling hovered like a pale shadow, his hands fluttering nervously at his sides. Honoria stopped, her expression shifting instantly into a mask of polished concern as she realized they were not alone with the girl. "There you are, Clara," Honoria said, her tone dripping with a sweetness that did not reach her eyes. She moved toward Clara, reaching out to adjust the girl's collar. She did not do it with affection. She did it with the practiced efficiency of a merchant, straightening a crooked picture frame before a sale. "Lord Percival has been looking everywhere for you. It is quite improper to hide when a guest is so eager for your company." Honoria turned to the Duke, her smile widening into something brittle and status-hungry. "Your Grace, I must apologize for my stepdaughter's lack of propriety. She is constitutionally difficult. A quiet girl perhaps, but one with little utility in a house of this standing." Sebastian Thorne remained seated, his hands resting motionless on the arms of his chair. He looked at Honoria, then at Arthur, and finally back to Clara. His gaze dropped to the ledger she held so tightly against her chest, the leather cover worn and stained with the work of 1,000 late-night audits. "Utility is a matter of perspective." "Lady Sterling," the Duke remarked, his voice as cold as damp slate, Honoria let out a short, forced laugh, a sound like breaking glass. "Oh, you are too kind, sir. But Clara is a drain on our resources, I fear. She spends her hours scribbling in those dusty books rather than attending to her duties. She is utterly useless to us, a burden her father has carried far too long. That is why this marriage to Lord Percival is such a blessing. It provides her with a home where her limitations will be tolerated." Arthur Sterling looked away, unable to meet his daughter's eyes. He knew the truth. He knew that without Clara's scrupulous management of the accounts he had neglected, the manor would have been lost to the creditors years ago. But he was a weak man, and the silence he kept was a betrayal that tasted like ash. Clara felt the insults settle over her, familiar and heavy. She did not flinch. She had heard it 100 times before, whispered in the hallways and spat in the counting room. She was the invisible engine, the silent architect of their survival, yet to them she was merely a line item to be erased. The Duke of Thorne stood then, rising to his full, formidable height. He moved with a slow, deliberate grace that drew all the air from the room. He walked toward Clara, ignored Honoria entirely, and came to a stop just inches from the girl. He looked down at her ink-stained fingers, then at the ledger, and finally into her eyes. The drawing room of Stirling Manor felt suddenly, violently small as the party moved from the library into the light of the fading afternoon. It was a chamber of fading opulence, where the cloying scent of Lady Honoria Sterling's expensive French perfume sought to mask the distinct smell of damp rot, the mounting debt that clung to the very wallpaper. Sebastian Thorne stood near the mahogany secretaire, a dark, immovable pillar draining the warmth from the fireplace. He remained silent, his grey eyes, the cool, unforgiving grey of a sky that has not decided whether to clear, observing the room with clinical precision. His mourning had wrapped him like a permanent winter, and in that time he had learned that the loudest voices in a room were almost always the most hollow. Lady Honoria Sterling flicked her lace fan with a sharp, rhythmic click that sounded like the snapping of small bones. She gestured toward Clara Sterling with a sneer rooted in deep, shivering insecurity. "She is a drain on our resources, Your Grace." Honoria hissed, her voice vibrating with status envy. "She spends her nights huddled over those wretched papers, wasting oil and ink on nonsense, utterly useless. I assure you, a wallflower with nothing but smudges on her fingers to show for her existence." Sir Arthur Sterling, nursing a glass of brandy his estate could no longer afford, looked everywhere but at his daughter. He was a man who had mastered the art of looking past the truth, his silence a betrayal written in the language of cowardice. He allowed the insult to hang in the air, thick and suffocating, waiting for the Duke to move on to the business of the boundary dispute. But Sebastian Thorne did not acknowledge the stepmother's venomous smile. His gaze was fixed on the small ink-stained ledger that Clara gripped against her chest. He had seen the way her eyes moved, not with the vapid curiosity of a girl seeking a husband, but with the analytical focus of a mind that saw the world in terms of structural integrity and cold arithmetic. He walked toward her, his boots striking the floor with a heavy thud that silenced Honoria's fan. He stopped inches from Clara, his height casting a shadow she did not shrink from. He reached out, his hand hovering near the edge of her ledger. "May I?" he asked. The request was not a command, but an invitation into a shared language. Clara's fingers trembled as she opened the book. The Duke scanned the pages, his eyes narrowing as he took in the meticulous columns, the corrected interest rates, and the scrupulous notes on crop rotation hidden beneath mundane household accounts. He saw the genius of it, the way she had been keeping her father's house solvent through sheer, unacknowledged intellectual labor. "A ledger is the one honest room in the world," the Duke said, his voice a low vibration that seemed to settle in the marrow of Clara's bones. He turned his head slightly, his profile like a bust carved from granite, to address the stunned Honoria. "You call her useless, madam. This girl has been performing the work of 3 stewards while you discussed the price of silk. She is the only person in this house who truly knows the cost of the air you breathe." He reached into the wool of his traveling coat and withdrew the iron key ring. It was a massive, archaic circle of metal holding the governance of Thorne Hall. The keys to the cellars, the library, and the secrets of a house that had been dying since the day his wife was buried. He held it out to Clara. The keys chimed together, a cold, metallic music that signaled the end of her life as a ghost. "My house is a mausoleum, Miss Penhaligon," he said, his gaze locking onto hers. "It is choked with dust and the silence of 7 years. I have need of someone who is not afraid of the dark and who can speak the truth to a man who has forgotten how to hear it. I am hiring you as my estate's administrator, not as a servant, and certainly not as a guest." He placed the keys in her hand. The weight was sudden and immense, a physical manifestation of authority that made Clara's wrist dip. It was the first time in her 24 years that someone had handed her power instead of a chore. Honoria let out a sharp, jagged gasp of indignation, her face turning a mottled red as she realized that the useless girl was being taken away by the most powerful man in the county. The journey to Thorne Hall was a study in profound, rhythmic stillness. Sebastian Thorne sat opposite her, his hands resting on his knees. He did not offer small talk, he offered only the space for her to exist. Clara watched him, realizing his silence was a fortress of suppressed grief. He was a sorrow wearing a man's coat, and for the first time she felt a flicker of recognition of a kindred isolation. When the carriage stopped, the house that loomed before them was more terrifying than any rumor. Thorne Hall was a leviathan of grey stone and damp slate, its chimneys rising like frozen fingers toward the moon. It was a house whose bones felt brittle and whose breath was the scent of ancient dust. Clara stepped onto the gravel, the iron key ring heavy in her pocket. The air here was sharper, tasting of the sea and neglected mahogany. She looked up at the darkened windows, her mind immediately beginning to calculate. The beeswax needed to polish the grand staircase, and the arithmetic of a house that had forgotten the sound of a human voice. Mrs. Beatrice Halloway stood at the top of the stone stairs, a woman of iron propriety and skeptical duty. She watched the Duke ascend, her eyes shifting to the girl with ink-stained fingers. "Your Grace," Mrs. Halloway said, her voice like the grating of a heavy door on rusted hinges. "The north wing is prepared, though we did not expect company." The Duke did not stop. "She is not company, Halloway," he said, his voice echoing in the cavernous entrance hall. "She is Miss Penhaligon. She carries the keys. You will accord her the respect due to the mistress of the house's governance." He disappeared into the darkness of the study, leaving Clara alone at the threshold. She stood in the center of the hall, her eyes tracing the thick layer of dust on the marble. She did not see a haunted mansion. She saw a patient that had been left to wither. She touched the smudge on her finger and felt the house beneath her, the way it seemed to lean toward her, desperate for the touch of someone who understood that even the greatest grief must eventually submit to the scrupulous light of a well-kept ledger. The silence, it seemed, had teeth. Clara whispered to the empty air. She reached into her pocket and gripped the iron key ring, the metal now warm from her own body. She looked at Mrs. Halloway, who remained frozen on the stairs. "We shall begin with the light, Mrs. Halloway. Bring me the candles, and then bring me the books. This house has held its breath long enough." The foyer of Thorne Hall was a limestone throat that seemed to swallow the very light of the afternoon, as the staff adjusted to the sharp authority in Clara's voice. As she stood upon the checkered marble, the iron key ring felt like a leaden weight against her thigh, a cold, insistent reminder of the sovereignty she had been granted and the resentment she had inherited. Before her stood the household staff, a line of weary figures who seemed less like servants and more like ghosts haunting a cathedral whose god had long since departed. At their head, Mrs. Beatrice Halloway stood with her black silk dress rustling with the dry, ominous sound of dead leaves scuttling across a tombstone. Mrs. Halloway refused to cast a single glance at Clara's face. Her gaze was fixed with a terrifying, singular intensity upon the heavy ring of keys hanging from Clara's belt. There was a mourning quality to that stare, as if the housekeeper were witnessing a desecration of a sacred relic rather than a transfer of administrative power. Clara felt the weight of that gaze, but she did not blink. It gnawed at the edges of the room, punctuated only by the distant, rhythmic drip of water from a cracked ceiling, rose somewhere in the shadows of the grand staircase. Clara drew her shoulders back, her spine forming a line of unyielding iron that her stepmother would have called obstinate, but which Clara knew to be the only thing keeping her from dissolving into the damp atmosphere. She recognized the look in the eyes of the footmen and the scullery maids. It was a mixture of practiced apathy and a deep institutional skepticism. They had seen the Duke's grief-stricken isolation for 7 years. They had watched the house slide into a slow, graceful decay. And they clearly expected this plain, ink-stained girl to be nothing more than another symptom of the master's madness. "I am Miss Penhaligon," Clara said, her voice sounding unnervingly crisp in the vaulted space. It was a voice trained by years of reading ledgers aloud to a father who refused to listen. A voice of measurement and clarity. "The Duke has placed the management of this household in my hands. I require the current inventory of the larder, the fuel accounts for the last quarter, and a seat in the steward's office." Mrs. Halloway finally shifted her gaze, but only to the hem of Clara's travel-worn pelisse. The housekeeper's mouth was a thin, hard line of suppressed indignation. "The steward's office has not been unlocked since the winter of the Great Frost, miss," she replied, her tone clipped and freezing. "And the accounts, such as they are, reside in a state that no lady of propriety would care to disturb. We have managed, after a fashion, without the interference of guests." Clara felt the sting of the word, but she did not flinch. She reached down and grasped the iron key ring, the metal biting into her palm with a grounding chill. "I am not a guest, Mrs. Halloway. I am the solution to a debt that this house can no longer afford to ignore. If the office is locked, I shall unlock it. If the accounts are disturbed, I shall settle them. We will begin with the keys." She stepped forward, the heavy ring chiming with a sharp, melodic authority that echoed through the hollow hall. Mrs. Halloway stepped aside, her skirts snapping with a sound like a whip, her eyes still cast downward, in a silent, bitter protest against the girl who dared to carry the Duke's authority. The steward's office was a mausoleum of paper and neglect, a room where time had seemingly curdled into a thick layer of grey dust. Clara closed the heavy oak door, shutting out the oppressive stillness of the hallway and the watchful, judging eyes of the staff. She did not immediately sit. Instead, she moved to the windows and forced them open, gritting her teeth as the frames shrieked in protest. A draft of sharp autumn air rushed in, stirring the stagnant scent of beeswax and old, rotting parchment. This was her element, not the ballroom, not the velvet-lined cages of social performance, but the scrupulous, honest reality of a workroom. She found the primary ledger buried beneath a mountain of unanswered correspondence and yellowed receipts. It was a massive, leather-bound volume that felt damp to the touch, its spine cracked like a broken rib. Clara cleared a space on the mahogany desk, her movements efficient and devoid of hesitation. She lit a single tallow candle, the flame dancing in the draught, and opened the book. The first thing she saw was not a record of prosperity, but a landscape of chaos. The handwriting of the former steward was a frantic, sloping mess, the script of an individual who was either constitutionally incapable of arithmetic or deliberately obscuring the truth. Clara dipped her quill into the encrusted inkwell, her ink-stained fingers finding their familiar rhythm. She began to cross-reference the storage receipts from the grain mill with the internal payout records, her lips moving in a silent, private dialogue with the numbers. "Numbers don't lie," she whispered into the gloom, her voice a low anchor in the rising wind outside. "People lie about them, but the sum remains the same." She found the first discrepancy within 20 minutes, a recurring payment to a supplier in London for tallow and coal that far exceeded the physical capacity of the Thorne Hall cellars. It was a leak, a systemic theft hidden in the brambles of bad penmanship. As she worked, the house seemed to settle around her, its ancient timbers groaning like a giant trying to find a comfortable position. Clara did not feel the cold, she felt only the heat of the hunt. She corrected a 7-year-old error in the livestock tax, her quill scratching across the parchment with a sound like a small, industrious animal. Each correction was a stitch in a tattered garment, each balanced column a victory against the entropy that had nearly consumed the Duke's legacy. She was no longer the useless girl of the Sterling household. She was the architect of a new order. Her mind a ledger where every debt was recorded and every theft would eventually be answered. The candle flickered lower, casting long, skeletal shadows across the rows of figures, but Clara did not stop. She had found the teeth in the house's silence, and she intended to pull them, one by one. Sebastian Thorne moved through the corridors of Thorne Hall like a ghost haunting his own inheritance. The house, which had once been a vessel of laughter and light, had long since become a mausoleum of cold stone and unbreathable silence. It was late, the hour, when the shadows seemed to stretch with a predatory intent. As he approached the library, he expected to find it empty, a dark cavern of unread history, but a sliver of amber light bled from beneath the heavy mahogany door. He pushed it open with the grace of a man who no longer feared what he might find in the dark. The Duke found Clara Sterling not as a lady-in-waiting, but as a soldier fallen at her post. She was fast asleep, her head pillowed by the crook of her arm atop a sprawl of documents. The candle beside her was a guttering stump, casting a rhythmic, flickering light that danced across the sharp lines of her profile. Sebastian remained in the doorway, his presence heavy and still. He was an embodiment of pure heartbreak, a figure carved from 7 years of unrelenting winter, yet he found himself rooted to the spot by the sheer, quiet industry of the scene before him. He crossed the room with footsteps that made no sound on the thick Persian rug. His gaze fell upon the ink-stained ledger, the one honest room in the world, as he had come to think of it. It was open to a section of the estate's accounts that had remained a tangled thicket of confusion for nearly a decade. His former stewards had insisted the losses were a matter of poor harvests and inevitable decay, a narrative he had been too hollowed by grief to challenge. Sebastian leaned closer, his eyes narrowing as he scanned her work. Clara had not merely balanced the books, she had performed a scrupulous autopsy on them. In the margins, written in a hand that was elegant but unfailingly precise, she had noted the systemic tax evasion that had been bleeding the estate dry. She had traced the grain tithes from the outlying farms to a series of phantom accounts, revealing a theft so brazen it could only have been achieved through the calculated indifference of the master of the house. He looked down at her hand, which lay curled near a bottle of black ink. Her fingers were stained to the knuckles, a mark of labor that his stepmother would have deemed common, but which Sebastian saw as the signature of a rare and rigorous intellect. It was the first time in 7 years that he looked at a person and did not see a grave. Instead, he saw a mind that had looked at his chaos and demanded order. Without waking her, Sebastian reached for the heavy wool coat he had draped over his arm. He settled it over her shoulders with a gentleness that felt foreign to his own hands. The garment was vast on her small frame, the smell of bergamot and cold rain surrounding her like a shield. He did not wake her. He simply stood there, watching the rise and fall of her breath, realizing that the house was finally, tentatively, beginning to breathe with her. Morning arrived at Thorne Hall not as a welcome guest, but as a creditor demanding an account of the night's secrets. Clara woke as the grey light of dawn began to dissolve the shadows of the library. Her neck was stiff, and the scent of expensive wool and masculine solitude was the first thing she registered. She touched the heavy coat on her shoulders, her heart stuttering against her ribs. The realization that the Duke had seen her in such a state of undignified exhaustion brought a flush to her cheeks, yet the weight of the garment felt like the first piece of genuine protection she had known in years. She stood, her joints protesting, and began to gather the papers she had been auditing. It was then that she noticed a drawer in the massive desk had been left slightly ajar, perhaps disturbed when she had reached for a fresh quill in the middle of the night. It was a shallow, hidden compartment, its existence masked by the intricate scrollwork of the mahogany. Inside lay a bundle of letters, tied not with a ribbon, but with a piece of rough twine. As Clara pulled them out, the silence of the library seemed to sharpen. The quietness felt sudden and predatory. At the center of the bundle was a series of unpaid demands, each one stamped with the North Wing seal. It was a black wax seal, brittle with age and neglect. When she touched it, a flake of the wax crumbled under her thumb, releasing a faint, ghostly scent of old lavender. It was a scent that did not belong in a library. It belonged in a sick room or a casket. The North Wing had been locked for 7 years, a place of rumors and stagnant air that the servants spoke of, only in hushed tones. As Clara scanned the dates on the letters, her brow furrowed. They were all dated from the year the Duke's grief had begun, the year his silence had frozen into stone. These were not love letters, nor were they missives of war. They were bills of sale, promissory notes, and legal threats centered on the maintenance of the North Wing. The numbers were staggering, representing a drain on the estate that Clara's previous audit had not accounted for. It was a paper trail of grief, a financial weight that Sebastian Thorne had been carrying in secret, allowing the rest of his lands to rot so that he might preserve whatever ghost resided behind those locked doors. The wax of the seal was cold against her skin, a stark contrast to the sharp, metallic weight of the heavy master keys to the Duke's storage that hung from her belt. Clara realized that her task was far greater than she had first calculated. She was not just here to repair a ledger, she was here to audit a soul. The North Wing seal was the lock, and the numbers she had discovered were the only map she had to the man who had hidden himself within his own castle. She carefully returned the letters to the hidden drawer, her mind already moving through the arithmetic of the situation. The estate was solvent, or it could be, if the bleeding from the North Wing was stopped. But to stop it would be to demand that Sebastian Thorne face whatever truth he had buried in the lavender-scented dark. Clara looked at her ink-stained fingers and felt a surge of quiet iron. She would not be a passive witness to this house's demise. If she was the solution he had been looking for, then she would have to be brave enough to ask the questions that no one else dared to whisper. The house held its breath as she stepped out into the hallway. The Duke's coat still draped over the chair behind her, a silent witness to a recognition that had only just begun. The following morning, the north wing of Thorne Hall remained a place where the air seemed to possess a different, heavier weight, a sanctuary of dust and unaddressed ghosts that Sebastian Thorne had willed himself to forget. However, the black wax of the north wing seal did not respect the boundaries of a man's silence. Clara Sterling stood in the center of the Duke's private study, her fingers stained with the permanent soot of a dozen newly audited ledgers, holding a stack of letters that had not been opened in half a decade. The room was cold, the fire having died down to a few glowing embers that struggled against the damp draft of a restless Tuesday evening. Sebastian did not look up from the map he was ostensibly studying, though his posture remained as rigid as the granite cliffs of the northern coast. He had carried his sorrow like a physical burden for nearly a decade, and Clara was beginning to realize that any attempt to discuss the estate's actual financial health required navigating the storms he kept locked behind his teeth. She placed the letters on the mahogany desk, the sound of the thick parchment hitting the wood echoing like a small, sharp gavel. The interest on these accounts has reached a point where the silence of the North Wing is no longer affordable, Your Grace, Clara said, her voice steady and rhythmic, devoid of the trembling that usually accompanied a commoner addressing a peer of the realm. The creditors associated with these particular seals have been quiet because they were being paid from the Tenant Improvement Fund. It is a mathematical impossibility for Thorne Hall to remain solvent if we continue to prioritize the past over the present. Sebastian finally looked at her, his grey eyes the color of a sky that had not decided whether to clear or to unleash a deluge. The wordless tension was vicious. It bit into the space between them, demanding a retreat that Clara refused to grant. He reached out, his hand hovering over a cedar pencil. He did not touch the letters. Instead, his fingers tightened around the slender wood until a sharp, dry crack splintered the quiet of the library. The pencil snapped in two, the yellow paint flaking off like dead skin. It was the first time she had seen the Duke's stoic mask falter, a physical manifestation of a debt that was more than just arithmetic. You speak of these things as if they are merely digits on a page, Miss Penhaligon, he said, his voice clipped and hoarse. You do not understand the architecture of what was lost in that wing. You were hired to mend the books, not to audit my memory. Numbers do not lie, Your Grace, Clara countered, her spine straightening. Individuals twist their meanings. Your former steward lied about where the coin was going, so he could avoid telling you that the roof of the granary was rotting. He let the estate bleed to keep your ghosts comfortable. I cannot, in good conscience, allow the living to starve for the sake of a wax seal. Sebastian stared at the broken halves of the pencil in his palm. The tension in the room was iron hard, a high-status spa where the only currency was the truth. For a moment, she thought he might dismiss her, might send her back to the Sterling Manor where Honoria's insults waited like vipers. Instead, he dropped the wood and exhaled a breath he seemed to have been holding since she entered. Then fix it, he whispered, the command sounding more like a confession. Fix the math. If you are so certain, it is the only honest thing left in this house. The transition from the suffocating atmosphere of the Duke's study to the raw, damp reality of the tenant farms was a spatial movement that Clara welcomed. By the following afternoon, she had traded her indoor slippers for stout leather boots, the hem of her plain brown dress already splattered with the red clay mud of the lower valley. She found Thomas Miller standing at the edge of a field that looked as tired as the man himself. The soil was a pale, exhausted grey, lacking the rich, dark hue of a healthy pasture. Miller failed to regard her with the deference usually reserved for a representative of Thorne Hall. He looked at her with the weary suspicion of someone that had seen a succession of men in fine coats promise relief while increasing the rent. Clara did not wait for an invitation. She walked into the center of the field, knelt in the mud, and drove her fingers into the earth. It was cold and clumped with too much clay. Devoid of the nutrients required for the winter wheat the tenants were being forced to plant. The steward told us the rent was high because the Duke required a premium for the superior drainage of these acres, Miller said, his voice thick with a simmering indignation. But the water sits like a lake every time it rains, and the grain we harvest is thin as a ghost's hair. We are being overcharged for land that is essentially a graveyard for seeds. Clara stood up, wiping her ink-stained fingers on a handkerchief before reaching for a fallen branch from a nearby oak. She didn't offer empty platitudes or the cold comfort of a ledger. Instead, she began to draw in the dirt at Miller's feet. With sharp, purposeful strokes, she sketched a map of the valley's water table, showing him where the drainage had been blocked by a neglected culvert 3 miles upstream. You are being overcharged because the steward was pocketing the difference between the actual value and the premium he invented, Clara explained. Her eyes focused on the map in the mud. This soil is not dying, it is drowning. If we pivot the crops, clover here to fix the nitrogen and a trench cut along this line, we can restore the balance by spring. I have audited the heavy master keys to the Duke's storage, and there is a surplus of lime that has been sitting unused for 3 years. It is yours, not as a gift, but as a correction of the theft you have endured. Miller looked from the map in the dirt to the woman with the straight spine and the practical mind. He saw a competence that did not require a title to command respect. He saw, perhaps for the first time, a person of authority who looked at the land and saw its potential rather than its price. Clara watched him, the brass and iron loop hanging heavy at her waist. A weight that no longer felt like a burden but like a tool. I was told the Duke's new accountant was a useless girl sent away in disgrace, Miller muttered, a flicker of thawing hope in his eyes. Clara adjusted the keys, the metal clinking with a sound of finality. People say many things when they are afraid of someone who can actually count, she replied. Now, show me the boundary stones. We have a great deal of work to do before the frost sets in, and the house has been holding its breath for far too long. The mill at Blackwood Brook was a moss-slicked structure that served as the unyielding heart of the valley's commerce. Inside, the air was a thick cloud of flour dust, and the rhythmic, bone-deep thrumming of the great wheel made the very marrow of one's bones vibrate. It ground more than just wheat. It ground the spirit of the Thorne tenants into a fine, bitter residue. Mr. Brackwell, the man who had served as the estate's primary steward for a decade, stood upon the loading dock, with his arms crossed over a chest padded by the very profits he had embezzled from the Duke's table. He was a man of florid complexion, and a voice that sounded like a saw hitting a knot in a dry pine board. When Clara Sterling approached, her stout leather boots caked in the red clay mud of the lower valley, and the ink-stained ledger tucked firmly under her arm, he did not offer a bow. He offered only a laugh, a sound like breaking glass. I was told a girl had been sent to play with the books, but I did not expect her to bring the mud of the fields with her. Brackwell sneered, his gaze sweeping over Clara with calculated contempt. This is a place of business, Miss Penhaligon. It is no room for a wallflower to practice her penmanship. We have a dispute over the winter grain yields, a matter for men who understand the weight of a harvest, not the scent of a drawing room. Clara did not flinch. She knew that in this arena, anger was a currency that bought nothing. Instead, she stepped forward until she stood at the edge of the dock, her spine a column of unyielding iron. She opened the ledger, the pages turning with a crisp, authoritative snap that cut through the low rumble of the millstones. It is precisely because I understand the weight of a harvest that I am here, Mr. Brackwell. she replied, her voice steady and resonant. "I have audited the delivery receipts and cross-referenced them with the grinding logs you so carelessly left in the steward's office. Mathematics is inherently truthful. People, however, possess a remarkable talent for the craft." She pointed to a specific column of figures, her ink-stained finger tracing the line with surgical precision. "You have recorded a 10% loss in yield due to moisture rot across every farm in the valley. A statistical impossibility, given that the rainfall has been the most consistent we have seen in 7 years. Furthermore, the weight of the raw grain delivered by Thomas Miller and his neighbors does not match the output of the flour shipped to the London markets." She looked up, her gaze locking onto Brackwell's with a cold, analytical intensity. "You are skimming the top, sir. You have been taking 1/10 of every bushel and selling it through a secondary channel in the next county. I found the transport records from the carter quite easily once I knew to look for a debt that did not belong on the books." The crowd of tenants, led by Miller, drew closer, their faces etched with a mixture of shock and a blossoming hope. Brackwell's face shifted from florid to a mottled, sickly purple. He moved toward her, as if to snatch the ledger away, but he stopped abruptly. The air in the mill yard had suddenly grown cold. The kind of cold that preceded a mountain storm. Sebastian Thorne had arrived. He did not call out, nor did he ride in with the fanfare of a lord. He simply appeared at the edge of the yard, a spectre draped in wool, his presence so still and formidable that the machinery of the mill seemed to slow in deference. He stood behind Clara, his grey eyes fixed on the steward, with detached, clinical judgment. The Duke did not speak to the steward. He looked only at the back of Clara's head, observing the way she held her ground, a small figure of absolute competence in a world of sprawling corruption. "Is the calculation complete, Miss Penhaligon?" the Duke asked, his baritone a low vibration in the damp air. "It is, Your Grace," Clara replied, not turning to look at him. She kept her eyes on the man she was dismantling. "The theft is systemic, calculated, and amounts to nearly £400 over the last fiscal year alone. It is a debt that has been paid in the hunger of your people." The utter stillness was sharp as a blade. It bit into Brackwell's bravado until the man began to tremble. He turned to the Duke, his voice a frantic, oily whine. "Your Grace, surely you do not believe the scribblings of a girl. She is an outsider, a useless drain on the Sterlings who was sent here as a charity. I have served this house for 10 years. You have served yourself from this house for 10 years. Sebastian interrupted, his voice as cold as the stone of a tomb. He walked toward the loading dock, each footstep a rhythmic, heavy thud that signaled the end of an era. He stopped beside Clara and reached for the cluster of keys hanging from his own belt. He viewed the steward not as a man, but as a smudge of ink on a clean page. "You will hand over the keys to the mill and the granary, Brackwell, now." With a shaking hand, the steward reached for the ring at his waist. He held it out, expecting the Duke to take it, but Sebastian gestured toward Clara. "No," the Duke said, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of an executioner's axe. "You will hand them to the administrator of Thorne Hall. You will look at the woman you called useless, and you will acknowledge the master of this estate's governance." Brackwell, his face twisted in humiliated rage, was forced to lean down and place the keys into Clara's open palm. The metal was cold and heavy, a physical manifestation of a power she had earned through the scrupulous labor of her mind. As the keys hit her palm with a sharp, melodic clink, the house, and the land it sat upon, seemed to finally let out a breath it had been holding for 7 long years. Sebastian turned to the crowd of tenants. "The debts of the past will be audited," he announced, "and the stolen grain will be returned to the winter stores. Miss Penhaligon has the final word on the distribution. Speak to her as you would speak to me." He paused before walking back toward the carriage, looking at Clara as an equal. "I believe the mill is now solvent, Miss Penhaligon," he remarked, a shadow of a grim, respect-filled smile touching his mouth. "Do not be late for dinner. We have the North Wing accounts to discuss, and I find I am no longer afraid of the arithmetic." Clara gripped the keys tightly, her fingers still stained with the ink of the truth. She watched the Duke's retreating figure and felt a surge of safety. Being seen by the right person was not the danger she had once feared. It was the only sanctuary worth the name. Have you ever had a moment where your silence was your shield, only to realize that your voice was the only thing that could truly set you free? Tell me if you have ever had to prove your worth to those who were determined to see only your surface. I look forward to hearing your stories from the fireside tonight." The sound of Thorne Hall had begun to change. For 7 years, the house had existed in a state of suspended animation, a mausoleum of dust and unspoken grief that seemed to swallow every vibration of life. The profound hush possessed a malicious edge. It gnawed at the edges of the tapestries and ate through the resolve of the remaining staff. But under the scrupulous direction of Clara Sterling, the heavy, stagnant air was finally being displaced. It began in the kitchens, where the rhythmic scrubbing of stone against stone replaced the hollow echoes of neglect. Mrs. Beatrice Halloway stood by the great hearth, her arms folded over her chest, watching with a mixture of professional wariness and dawning respect as the new manager of the household rearranged the very bones of the domestic operation. Clara did not simply issue orders. She audited the environment with the same precision she applied to a column of figures. She moved through the damp pantry, identifying which sacks of flour were salvageable and which had been surrendered to the weevils of time. Her hands, usually stained with the ink of her ledgers, were now tucked into the pockets of a plain, functional apron as she discussed the logistics of the winter stores. Mrs. Halloway observed the way the young woman measured the remaining tallow candles, noting the exact weight and the burn rate with a level of arithmetic rigor that the house had not seen in a decade. There was no room for waste in the new architecture of Thorne Hall, and yet there was no cruelty in Clara's economy. She spoke to the kitchen maids not as interchangeable units of labor, but as vital components of a machine that had long been left to rust. In a forgotten corner of the dry stores room, tucked behind a jar of preserved plums that had turned to black silt, Clara discovered a small, fragile object. It was a sprig of dried lilac, brittle and translucent with age, yet still retaining the ghost of a scent that whispered of a time before the frost had settled over the Duke's heart. She held it for a moment, her thumb tracing the delicate, papery blossoms. It was a sensory anchor to a forgotten prosperity, a sign that the house had once known the warmth of a lighter season. She did not discard it. Instead, she placed it carefully upon the ledge of the window where the pale autumn light could reach it. Mrs. Beatrice Halloway noticed the gesture, her stern features softening for the briefest of intervals. The house was no longer holding its breath. It was at long last beginning a slow, shuddering exhale. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, skeletal shadows across the moor, Clara retreated to the library. The smell of boiling rosemary and vinegar from the kitchens followed her, a sharp, clean scent that warred with the ancient aroma of leather and damp parchment. Sebastian Thorne was already there, a monument to melancholy, as he sat motionless by the dying embers of the fire. He did not look up when she entered, but the tension in his shoulders shifted, an acknowledgement of her presence that required no words. Clara placed the ink-stained ledger upon the mahogany desk, the heavy thud of the book acting as a summons. She did not wait for his permission to begin the evening's work. She understood that his silence was not a denial of her authority, but a refuge she was slowly learning to navigate. They began to discuss the estate's recovery, but the conversation did not remain confined to the grim reality of debt and decay. Sebastian possessed a mind that was as rigorous as it was wounded, and he found himself drawn into a strategic sparring match over the merits of the four-field crop rotation system. Clara countered his skepticism with the weight of her observations, citing the nitrogen-fixing properties of clover with a certainty that bordered on the scientific. To bridge the gap between his aristocratic education and her practical mastery, they turned to the classical texts that lined the shelves. Sebastian pulled a weathered volume of Virgil's Georgics from the shelf, his long, calloused fingers tracing the Latin verses as if seeking a cipher for his own survival. They used the ancient language as a private cipher, a way to discuss the secret investments and the structural rot of the estate, without the intrusion of the mundane. Clara's Latin was not the polished rhetoric of a university scholar, but the functional, precise tool of a woman who had taught herself the language of law and land. As she corrected his interpretation of a passage concerning the temperament of the soil, the intellectual spark between them became a tangible force, a warmth that had nothing to do with the hearth. Sebastian looked at her then, truly looked at her, and for a moment the grey of his eyes was not the colour of a winter sky, but of tempered steel. He saw the ink on her fingers not as a stain, but as the mark of a mind that refused to be silenced by the propriety of her station. Numbers do not lie, Sebastian thought as he watched her head bend over the ledger once more, but humans manipulate their truths. Clara Sterling was the only honest room in his world, a person who looked at the architectural ruin of his life and saw not a grave but a foundation. She was scrupulous in her demands and constitutionally unable to provide the shallow comfort of a lie. When she pointed to a discrepancy in the grain tithes, her voice remained even, a steady anchor in the storm of his own thoughts. She was the paymaster of his redemption, and as the candle flickered between them, the Duke realized that being seen by the right person was not the danger he had imagined. It was the only safety worth the name. The silence in the Duke's private study, however, remained a separate entity, a heavy, airless thing that seemed to have its own geography. It was a landscape of unread correspondence and ledgers that had not been balanced since the world was young. Clara moved through the room, with the quiet, practiced step of someone who had spent a lifetime making herself small, yet here her presence felt strangely significant. The mahogany shelves reached toward the ceiling like the ribs of a great, slumbering beast, and the scent of old parchment and cold stone clung to the shadows. It was in the bottom drawer of a desk that had seen no ink for 7 years that she found it, a withered purple blossom, so brittle that it seemed a single breath might shatter it into 1,000 grey memories. She held the withered stem between her smudged digits, observing the way the light from the tall, narrow windows caught the dust motes dancing around it. The flower was a ghost, a remnant of a season that Sebastian Thorne had long ago attempted to strike from his own internal ledger. It represented a time before the grief had turned to granite, before the wordless gloom of Thorne Hall had turned feral. Clara did not wonder who had given it to him or why it had been preserved in such a tomb-like state. She simply understood that a house cannot hold its breath forever without something inside it beginning to rot. Sebastian was standing by the fireplace, his broad shoulders casting a long, jagged shadow across the Persian rug. He did not turn when she entered, but the tension in his spine suggested he was acutely aware of her proximity. He had draped himself in mourning since his tragedy, and today the atmosphere around him was particularly stormy. He was a gentleman that had forgotten how to look at the living world without seeing a grave. Yet, as Clara approached, the coldness of the room seemed to shift. Just a fraction. Instead of asking the questions that a more curious or less scrupulous woman might have voiced, Clara crossed to a small crystal vase that sat empty upon a side table. She left the room for a moment and returned with a pitcher of cool, clear water. With a hand that was steady and sure, the hand of an auditor who knew the precise value of every grain of wheat and every shilling of debt, she filled the glass. She placed the faded floral relic into the water with the same reverence she might accord a sacred text. The action was a quiet declaration. It was an acknowledgement that while the past could not be undone, the present required a certain level of care. Sebastian finally turned, his grey eyes tracking her movements with a mixture of bewilderment and something that looked dangerously like hope. He looked at the flower, then at her, his gaze lingering on the smudges of ink that darkened her fingertips. In 7 years, she was the first person who had looked at his mourning and offered him a task instead of a prayer. The house seemed to sigh, a floorboard creaking in the hallway, as if the very bones of the building were settling into a new, more comfortable position. Sebastian did not speak, but the rigidity of his jaw softened. He watched her as she returned to the massive mahogany desk, her spine a straight line of intellectual defiance. She did not need his gratitude. She needed his ledgers. She needed the arithmetic of restoration. For Clara, the act of placing the lilac in water was not a romantic gesture, but a scrupulous one, a restoration of propriety to a room that had forgotten the smell of life. While Thorne Hall began to stir with the quiet energy of a house being reclaimed, the atmosphere at Stirling Manor was the colour of a bruise. The morning light filtered through yellowing curtains, illuminating the fraying edges of a life built on the shifting sands of social performance. Lady Honoria Sterling sat in the breakfast room, her posture a masterpiece of suppressed indignation, her fingers, clad in lace that had seen better decades, twitched rhythmically against the edge of the table. Across from her, Sir Arthur Sterling stared into his tea, as if the answers to his mounting debts might be found in the dregs of the leaves. He was a man who had allowed his estate to rot because the labor of maintenance was too heavy for his weak-willed constitution. For years, he had relied on the useless girl to balance the books in the dead of night, never acknowledging that it was her mind that kept the roof over their heads. Now that she was gone, the reality of his incompetence was beginning to bleed through the facade. The news had arrived not as a formal letter, but as a series of whispers that had traveled from the market town to the servants' hall. Thorne Hall was prospering. The tenants, once on the brink of revolt, were paying their rents with a new sense of loyalty. The systemic theft that had plagued the Duke's accounts for years had been excised like a tumor, and at the center of it all was Clara, the girl they had discarded like a broken chair. Honoria's glass-like laugh was nowhere to be heard. Instead, she gripped a piece of Belgian lace so tightly that the delicate threads began to snap, a sound like tiny breaking bones. Her malice was rooted in a very specific type of terror, the fear that the world would finally see her as she was, while the girl she had mocked ascended to a height she could never reach. The thought that Clara was now more liquid, more solvent, and more respected than the Sterling estate was a poison that Honoria could not swallow. Arthur's hands trembled as he pushed a stack of unpaid bills toward his wife. Without Clara's secret corrections, the arithmetic of their lives was failing. They had called her a drain on their resources, yet they were now realizing that she had been the only resource they truly possessed. The irony was a cold, hard stone in the center of the room. Honoria looked at the bills, then at the empty chair where Clara used to sit, and in that moment her insecurity curdled into a desperate predatory resolve. If the girl was indeed the master of Thorne Hall's prosperity, then she was far too valuable to be left in the Duke's hands. Honoria's status depended on the control of those she deemed inferior, and the realization that Clara had found a protector and an intellectual equal in Sebastian Thorne was an insult she could not endure. She looked at Arthur, her eyes narrowing with the cold calculation of an adversary who was prepared to shred her own soul, if it meant keeping her grip on the Sterling name. The silence in the room was not the peaceful stillness of Thorne Hall, but the jagged, hungry silence of a trap being set. The peace of Thorne Hall was shattered not by a scream, but by the rhythmic, intrusive crunch of wheels upon the gravel drive. Clara Sterling sat in the library, the North Wing accounts spread before her like a map of a forgotten war. She had been calculating the cost of roof repairs, an arithmetic of survival that the house seemed to appreciate with a quiet, settling groan of its timbers. But as the carriage stopped, the house began to hold its breath. It was a familiar, suffocating silence, one that tasted of Sterling Manor and the airless rooms of her father's neglect. She did not rise from the heavy mahogany desk. To rise was to acknowledge a fear she had long since buried beneath layers of scrupulous logic and ink-stained labor. Instead, she tightened her grip on her quill, her fingers leaving a small smudge on the margin of the ledger. The heavy doors swung open with a violence that ignored the propriety of the space, and Lord Percival Vane stood in the threshold. The damp autumn air clung to his velvet coat like a shroud, and he brought with him the cloying scent of an aristocrat who mistook arrogance for authority. He looked at the room with a proprietary sneer, his gaze sweeping over the shelves as if he already owned the dust upon them. "So," Lord Percival said, his voice like grinding gravel, "the mouse has found a larger hole to hide in." He walked into the library, his boots striking the floor with a thud that disrupted the sanctuary Clara had so carefully built. He refused to view her as an intellectual peer. He treated her as a piece of property that had slipped its leash. "You have led us on a wearying chase, Clara. Your father is quite distraught, though Honoria is more concerned with the breach of contract. You are a debt that remains unpaid, and I have come to Thorne Hall to collect my interest." Clara felt the old weight of her invisibility trying to settle over her shoulders, but she felt something else, the sharp, metallic bite of the estate keys against her thigh. She stood up then, her spine a column of unyielding iron that would not bow to the memory of her former life. When Percival reached out a hand to catch her wrist, she did not flinch. She swung the heavy keyring onto the desk with a force that made the crystal inkwell rattle. The sound echoed through the library like a gavel, a sharp and final declaration of her office. "I am not a mouse, Lord Percival, and I am certainly not a debt to be traded in the dark," she said, her voice sounding crisp and absolute. "I am the administrator of this estate. And you are a trespasser who has bypassed the porter's gate. Whatever agreement you believe you hold with Sir Arthur Sterling does not extend past the boundaries of this land. You have no authority here, and you certainly have no claim on me." Lord Percival Vane let out a laugh, a sharp, jagged thing that sounded like breaking glass. "Administrator, you? They were right to call you useless if this is the delusion you have cultivated in the shadows. You are a Penhaligon, and by the laws of both your station and your father, you belong at Stirling Manor until such time as you are moved to my own house. I do not care what keys the Duke has allowed you to polish as a hobby. You are coming with me." He lunged forward, but the shadows at the back of the library shifted with a terrifying grace. Sebastian Thorne stepped into the amber light of the hearth, his presence so sudden that the intruder stumbled back as if he had struck a stone wall. The Duke of Thorne was the very picture of contained anguish, but today the sorrow was edged with a cold, aristocratic fury. He did not look at Percival with anger. He looked at him with the detached judgment one might accord a smudge of dirt on a floor. He walked to the desk and stood beside Clara, his height casting a shadow that enveloped her in protection. "Your grammar is as impoverished as your manners, Lord Percival," Sebastian remarked, his baritone a low vibration that seemed to drain the heat from the room. He reached down and touched the meticulous account book, his hand resting near Clara's. "You said she belongs at Stirling Manor. The correct phrasing would be that she resided there. Past tense. Miss Penhaligon is not a line item in your gambling book, sir. She is the governance of this house." Lord Percival's face turned a mottled purple as he struggled to find his voice. "Your Grace, this is a private matter. This girl was promised to me to settle a debt her father could not cover. You are interfering with a settled agreement between gentlemen." "I am interfering with a theft," the Duke countered, his grey eyes turning to the precise colour of a winter storm. "You see her as a currency to be traded for a weak man's mistakes. I see her as the solution to 7 years of my own stagnation. She has audited the very soul of Thorne Hall and found it wanting, just as she has audited you and found you utterly bankrupt. I am well aware of the gambling debts you hold in London, Lord Percival, and the desperate hope you had that Clara's secret management of her father's grain would save you from the bailiffs." He turned to Clara, his gaze softening by the smallest of margins. It was the recognition she had hungered for. The look of a man who saw the mind behind the smudges. "Tell me, Miss Penhaligon," Sebastian said, his voice quiet, but carrying the weight of a decree, "is there any entry in our current records that accounts for a debt to a man of this caliber? Does our arithmetic require his presence?" Clara looked at Lord Percival, then back to the Duke. She felt the house breathing around her, the ancient stones standing in silent support of her authority. "There is no such entry, Your Grace," she replied, her voice steady. "Our accounts are scrupulously balanced, and we do not carry liabilities of a moral nature. Lord Percival is a 0 on our balance sheet." Sebastian Thorne turned back to the stunned suitor. "There you have it. The administrator has spoken, and arithmetic, as we have established, does not deceive. You will leave my lands immediately. If you return, I shall involve the London clubs, and I shall reveal exactly how you attempted to claim a woman as a debt payment to cover your own incompetence. I believe the North Wing seal carries enough weight to ensure your permanent social exile." Percival Vane's jaw worked in silence, his courage failing entirely in the face of a man who possessed both status and truth. He backed away, his boots scuffing the floorboards as he retreated. As the curricle rattled away, the house seemed to let out a long, shuddering exhale. Sebastian remained by the desk, his hand still resting near Clara's, the silence of the library now a warm and shared sanctuary. "The hunter has been sent away," he whispered, his grey eyes searching hers. "But I suspect Honoria will not be so easily deterred by a correction in grammar. Are you afraid, Clara?" "I hold the master keys, Sebastian," she replied, the use of his name a soft revolutionary act that felt like the final piece of the arithmetic falling into place. "And I have the truth. I am no longer afraid of anyone who tries to tell me I am useless. The Duke looked at her, and after 7 long years the ice in his heart began to melt. "Numbers don't lie," he said, a faint, respect-filled smile touching his mouth. "And the truth is, I would be utterly lost without my administrator." The heavy accounting volume lay open upon the mahogany desk like a patient upon a surgeon's table, its yellowed pages scarred with the erratic penmanship of a decade of neglect. Clara Sterling sat in the deepening shadows of the study at Thorne Hall, her spine as rigid as the iron fire-dogs in the hearth. For 3 nights, she had been meticulously comparing the secret records she had rescued from Stirling Manor with the official journals her father, Sir Arthur Sterling, had always claimed were the only truth. The silence of the room was heavy and oppressive, biting quiet, as it waited for her to articulate the betrayal she had finally unmasked. Her fingers, perpetually darkened at the tips by the labor of her mind, traced a column of figures that did not merely fail to balance, they screamed of a deliberate, scrupulous theft. She had been told for years that her existence was a burden, that her father's mounting debts were the weight of her dowry and the cost of her quiet, unornamented life. But the numbers, those cold and honest witnesses, has told a far different story. As Clara cross-referenced a series of fictitious entries labeled as estate repairs and tithe payments, she realized that every penny of the supposed Sterling debt had been a fabrication. Lady Honoria Sterling had not merely been a harsh stepmother, she had been a parasite. Clara found the pattern in the margins, small coded notations that corresponded with the dates of the London season. While Clara had been mending her own gowns and skipping meals to save the estate from what she believed was ruin, Honoria had been funneling the Sterling wealth into the bottomless pits of the gaming tables at the capital. The realization was a physical blow, a sudden chilling of the blood that made the stone walls of Thorne Hall feel like the only sanctuary she had ever known. The shameful debt that Arthur Sterling had used as a lash against Clara's spirit had never truly belonged to the land or its people. It was the price of Honoria's secret gambling habit, a debt of vanity paid for by Clara's years of invisibility. Clara felt a surge of cold triumph, though it was tempered by a profound melancholia. She was not the drain on the resources. She was the only reason the Sterling name had not already vanished into the debtor's prison. She had been the silent engine of a house that had sought to break her, correcting in the dead of night the very figures that her stepmother was sabotaging. Sebastian Thorne entered the room without a sound, his presence signaled only by the scent of rain and bergamot that seemed to cling to his heavy wool coat. He did not ask permission to join her. He simply stood by the hearth, a quiet shade of his former self, watching the way the candlelight caught the sharp, intelligent lines of her face. Clara did not look up immediately. She waited until the final sum was recorded, her pen scratching across the vellum with a definitive rhythmic finality. When she finally turned, her grey eyes met his, and for a moment, the distance of their ranks dissolved into the shared language of the work they had undertaken. He moved toward the desk, the metallic loop at his hip chiming softly, a sound that had become, for Clara, the very heartbeat of her new life. Sebastian looked down at the sprawling record, his expression unreadable, though there was a tension in his jaw that suggested he already understood the gravity of her discovery. He closed the door behind him, the latch clicking with a sound like a pistol cocking, and moved to sit in the chair opposite her. The firelight played across his features, highlighting the weariness he had worn like weather for 7 years, yet there was a new, flickering light in his gaze, a recognition of the woman who had dared to look into the darkness of his own ledgers and find the path to the sun. Clara slid the book toward him, her finger pointing to a specific set of entries from 3 years prior. She did not lead with emotion, she led with arithmetic. She explained how Honoria had masked the losses, how the useless daughter had been the only one scrupulous enough to notice the shifting of funds between the accounts. Sebastian listened in a stillness, so absolute it was as if the house itself were holding its breath, absorbing the truth of her words. As she spoke, describing the mechanics of the deceit with a cool, intellectual rigor, he reached out, his hand hovering just inches from hers on the open page. They sat so close that the warmth of his skin seemed to bridge the gap between their worlds. Sebastian's hand was calloused, the hand of an individual that had forgotten the ease of the aristocracy and instead embraced the hard labor of his own conscience. Clara's hand, smaller but equally marked by the ink of her trade, remained steady. In that small space between them, the mark of their shared effort, the ink, the dust, the weight of the secrets they carried, forged a bond that no social gatekeeper could hope to understand. He did not offer her empty platitudes or hollow comforts. Instead, he looked at the evidence of her mind and saw the true architecture of her soul. "Numbers don't lie," he said, his voice a low, resonant rasp that seemed to vibrate in the very floorboards. "People lie about them, but the ledger remains." He looked from the page to her face, his grey eyes searching hers with an intensity that made Clara's breath hitch in her throat. "You have spent your life being the shield for a house that did not deserve you, Clara. You corrected their sins in the dark, and they called you a failure for the privilege." He stood, pacing the length of the rug, his silhouette casting a long, dominant shadow against the rows of books. "The Sterling debt is a fiction," he continued, "and the truth of it is a weapon. I believe it is time we decided how you wish to wield it." Clara watched him, her heart hammering against her ribs like a bird in a cage of bone. For once in her life, she was not being told what she was. She was being asked what she wanted to become. Sebastian paused by the window, looking out at the dark, sprawling lands of Thorne Hall that were finally beginning to breathe again under her governance. The winter air was sharp outside, but within the library, the heat of the fire and the shared weight of their purpose created a sanctuary that felt more permanent than stone. He turned back to her, his face softening with a look of profound, intellectual respect. "In 7 years, you are the first person who has looked at the ledger and seen the life hidden within the numbers," he whispered, "and you are the first who has looked at me and not seen a grave." He returned to the desk and placed his hand over hers, the contact deliberate and grounding. The ink from her fingers smudged onto his skin. A shared mark of their partnership that neither seemed inclined to wash away. The proof of Honoria's crimes lay between them, a ledger of truth that would soon become the instrument of their vindication. Clara felt a thawing hope beginning to stir. A realization that being seen by the right person was not the danger she had feared, but the only safety worth the name. They remained there for a long time, the quietude no longer feeling hostile, but offering instead the quiet, steady rhythm of two minds working as one toward a future they would write together. The great hall of Thorne Hall was a cavernous space, where the echoes of the past often drowned out the necessities of the present. On this particular afternoon, the air was thick with the scent of wet wool, stale tobacco, and the collective indignation of men who were unaccustomed to being corrected by a woman with darkened fingertips. Clara Sterling stood at the head of the heavy mahogany table, her spine as straight as a ledger line. Before her lay the large, leather-bound volume that had become her primary weapon, the worn financial journal. Across from her, the regional landowners sat in a jagged semicircle of skepticism, their faces illuminated by the flickering, uncertain light of the hearth. Lord Percival Vane was among them, his presence a dark stain upon the proceedings. He lounged in his chair with a calculated insolence, his gaze flickering between the open pages of the ledger and the composed face of the woman he still intended to possess as a prize for his debts. "The proposed adjustments to the grain prices are a fantasy," one of the older squires declared, striking the table with a fist that smelled of horsehair and port. "We have operated on the 5-shilling margin since the war. It is a matter of propriety, Miss Penhaligon." Clara did not blink. She did not allow her hand to tremble as she turned a page of the ledger, the paper crisp and unforgiving in the silence. "Propriety, sir, does not pay the tithes when the soil is exhausted. If you look at the figures for the last 3 seasons, you will see a steady decline in yield per acre. The 5-shilling margin was an act of vanity, not arithmetic. To continue, it is to invite the ruin of every tenant on your land." She spoke with the cool precision of a surgeon, her voice carrying to every corner of the shadowed room, cutting through the thick atmosphere of masculine entitlement. Sebastian Thorne stood by the fireplace, his broad shoulders casting a long shadow across the stone floor. He remained silent, a desolate figure, yet his presence was a shield that Clara felt at her back. He watched her, not with the condescension of a master, but with the quiet awe of one watching a storm-tossed ship finally find the North Star. Lord Percival Vane leaned forward, his voice a silken threat that made the very air feel colder. "And where, pray tell, Did a daughter of Sir Arthur learn to calculate the ruin of men? Perhaps this is merely a performance to distract us from the Duke's own instabilities. Clara met his gaze with a level stare. She did not offer him the satisfaction of a flush or a stammer. She simply pointed to a row of figures in the ledger, her fingers stained with the blue-black ink of a dozen sleepless nights, spent in the service of a house that was not her own. The numbers do not lie, my lord. Men may deceive with them, certainly, but the arithmetic remains honest. If you care to examine the interest rates, you have been charging your own subtenants against the actual market value of their labor, you will find that it is not the Duke's instability that should concern this room. It is your own ledger, which I have taken the liberty of cross-referencing. The silence that followed was not merely quiet, it was heavy with the weight of a truth that had been buried for too long. Percival Vane's smile faltered, his eyes narrowing into slits of pure, concentrated malice. He looked as though he wished to strike the book from the table, but the Duke shifted his weight ever so slightly by the fire, and the threat remained unspoken. Clara did not look for Sebastian's approval, yet she felt the warmth of his recognition like a physical touch. Later, the late afternoon sun hung low in the sky, casting long, golden fingers across the neglected gardens of Thorne Hall. It was the hour when the light was most honest, stripping away the pretenses of the day and revealing the bones of the world. Sebastian Thorne led Clara down the stone steps of the terrace, away from the lingering tension of the hall and toward the walled garden where the air smelled of damp stone and the sharp, green scent of emerging life. He walked with a rhythmic, measured stride, his stillness a stark contrast to the chaotic volatility of the men they had just left behind. In his hand, he carried a single sheet of heavy vellum, the ink still fresh upon its surface. He did not take her to the library, that mausoleum of unread books and frozen grief where they had first met. He took her to the heart of the land itself. They stopped beneath an ancient oak, its branches skeletal against the amber sky, but its roots deep and unyielding. Sebastian turned to her, his grey eyes catching the light like polished flint. "They will not forgive you for being right, Clara," he said, his voice a low vibration that seemed to come from the earth itself. "Men of their station prefer a comfortable lie to an uncomfortable truth." Clara looked at the iron and brass keys at her waist, the weight of it a constant reminder of the trust she had been given. "I did not come here to be forgiven, Your Grace. I came here to ensure the house could breathe again." Sebastian looked at the parchment in his hand. The document that granted her full power of attorney, a legal transfer of his own sovereign authority over the estate. It was a gesture of trust that surpassed anything the London season could ever produce. He placed the vellum against the rough, dark bark of the oak tree and took a pen from his pocket. "A ledger is the only honest room in the world," you said. He signed his name with a firm, scrupulous hand, the scratch of the nib loud in the quiet garden. But a house is more than a ledger. It is a living thing. For 7 years, I have let my despair rule my existence, letting the rain rot the beams and the frost crack the stones. I thought the silence was a sanctuary, but you have shown me that the isolation was devouring me. He handed her the signed document, his fingers brushing hers for a brief electric second. In that touch there was no demand, only a profound recognition of equality that left Clara breathless. "With this, you are the voice of Thorne Hall. You are the architect of its restoration, in court and in the fields. I do not give you these keys because I am weary of the burden. Though I am, I give them to you because you are the only person who has looked at me and not seen a grave." Clara took the parchment, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She looked at the signature, Sebastian Thorne, Duke of Thorne, and realized that she was no longer the invisible daughter running from a debt. She was the mistress of a destiny. The house behind them seemed to sigh, a shifting of stone and timber that felt like a long-held breath finally being released. As they walked back toward the terrace, a single brittle blossom, caught in the cuff of her sleeve from her earlier work in the library, fell onto the dark earth. It was a small thing, a sensory anchor of the hope that was finally, scrupulously, beginning to bloom in the cold soil of Thorne Hall. Sebastian did not speak again, but he did not need to. The silence between them was no longer a void. It was a conversation of shared intent. The path ahead would be fraught with the indignation of those she had humiliated. Yet finally, Clara Sterling did not feel like she was running. She was standing her ground, and the ground was finally her own. The peace was short-lived, for the gravel of Thorne Hall soon crunched under the wheels of the Sterling carriage, a sound that, only months prior, would have echoed through a silent graveyard of neglect. Now, the great house stood, illuminated against the evening sky, its windows like warm, golden eyes observing the approach of those who had once discarded its savior. Lady Honoria Sterling stepped from the carriage with the practiced, predatory grace of a woman who believed the world was a stage built solely for her performance. Her silk pelisse was a shade too bright for the occasion, and her eyes were sharp with a desperate, calculating hunger as she surveyed the restored masonry of the entrance. Beside her, Sir Arthur Sterling moved with the hesitant, stooped posture of someone who had long ago traded his integrity for a quiet life. They entered the hall, and Honoria's gaze swept upward, searching for the dust and decay she remembered. She found only the terrifying efficiency of a house that had been mastered. When they reached the dining room, Honoria moved instinctively toward the head of the long mahogany table. It was a gesture of ancient habit, a claim to the throne of the house. She reached for the chair that signified the highest rank among women, her chin tilted in an expression of expected dominance. "I am afraid that seat is reserved, my lady," a voice said, cool and precise as the striking of a silver bell. Mrs. Beatrice Halloway stood by the sideboard, her posture as rigid as the stone foundations of the hall. She did not bow. She did not offer the sycophantic smile Honoria was accustomed to receiving from those she considered beneath her. Reserved. Honoria's voice held the edge of breaking glass. "I am the mother of the house from which your new employee originated. Surely you do not intend to seat the mother of the family among the lower guests?" "The mistress of the house has designated the seating according to the current protocol of Thorne Hall," Mrs. Halloway replied, her eyes never wavering from Honoria's face. "If you would be so kind as to take the chair to the Duke's left, my lady. Your husband shall be seated opposite you." The silence that followed was suffocating. Honoria looked at the empty chair at the head of the table, the seat of authority, and then at the place assigned to her. The shift in power was not a loud explosion. It was the quiet, terrifying click of a lock turning. Clara Sterling entered the room then, her spine a straight line of uncompromising dignity. She wore a gown of dark, understated wool, and her only ornament was a sprig of dried lilac pinned to her bodice. She did not look like a servant hiding in a library. She looked like the soul of the house, and ultimately, Sir Arthur could not bring himself to meet his daughter's eyes. Dinner proceeded with a rhythmic, heavy precision that made the Sterling family appear small and frivolous. Sebastian Thorne sat at the far end of the table, his grey eyes fixed not on the silver or the wine, but on Clara. He was a vessel of silent misery no longer. He was a master who had found his intellectual equal, and he watched her with a stillness that was more protective than any sword. The conversation was a shallow thing. Honoria's forced anecdotes about the London season, Arthur's mumbled inquiries about the price of grain, until the covers were removed for the final course. Instead of a sweetmeat or a savoury, the footman placed a heavy, silver-domed platter directly in front of Lady Honoria Sterling. The room grew so still that the flickering of the candles sounded like the beating of wings. Clara stood, her ink-marked hands resting lightly on the edge of the white linen cloth. "You once told the Duke that I was a drain on your resources," Clara said, her voice even, and devoid of the tremors that had once haunted her speech. "You called me utterly useless in the presence of my father and this house's master. I found that my curiosity regarding that assessment led me to a rather interesting set of arithmetic." She nodded to the footman. He lifted the silver dome with a flourish that felt like a sentence being passed. There, resting on the velvet-lined tray, was not food, but the heavily marked ledger, the secret account book Clara had kept at Sterling Manor. Beside it lay a series of meticulously transcribed documents, each one stamped with the authority of Thorne Hall. "Figures lack the capacity for falsehood, Honoria," Clara continued, the words falling like stones into a deep, still pond. "People lie about them. In the 3 years following my mother's passing, exactly £4,000 were moved from the Sterling Maintenance Fund into a private account in London, an account held in your name. The repairs to the tenant roofs that were never made, the wages for the staff that were withheld while you purchased silk pelisses. They are all here, written in your own hand. Honoria's face turned the color of damp slate. She reached for her wineglass, her hand shaking so violently that the crystal rattled against her teeth. This is a fabrication. Arthur, are you going to sit there and allow this? This common girl to insult your wife at a duke's table. Sir Arthur looked at the ledger, his gaze lingering on the columns of figures he had been too weak to audit himself. He looked at Clara, then at the Duke, and finally he looked down at his own empty hands. The weight of his own neglect seemed to pin him to his chair, rendering him a ghost in his own skin. I am the payment, Honoria, Clara whispered, leaning forward so that the candlelight caught the cold fire in her eyes. You sold me to Thorne Hall to hide the debt of your thefts, thinking I would be buried in this mausoleum and forgotten. But a ledger is the only honest room in the world, and I have cleaned every corner of yours. You are not a guest here, you are a debtor standing in the house of your creditor. Sebastian Thorne stood then, his presence dominating the room like a gathering storm. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The house itself seemed to lean in to hear his judgment. I believe the meal is concluded, he said, his gaze fixed on Honoria with a cold, aristocratic finality that brooked no argument. Mrs. Halloway will show you to the door. My house no longer has room for those who do not understand the value of the woman who saved it, nor for those who would call useless the mind that has brought Thorne Hall back to life. The dining room of Thorne Hall, once a cavern of frozen echoes and neglected silver, felt remarkably small as Sebastian Thorne stood at the head of the mahogany table. The candlelight did not dance. It stood straight and unwavering, much like the man himself. Sebastian reached into the inner pocket of his charcoal-colored coat and produced a packet of papers, bound not in the festive ribbons of a guest, but in the grim black wax of the North Wing seal, the very mark that had for 7 years signaled the slow death of his own estate. He did not look at Sir Arthur Sterling, whose face had gone the color of damp parchment, nor at Lady Honoria Sterling, whose lips were pressed into a thin line of indignation. His gaze remained fixed upon Clara Sterling, who sat with her spine as straight as a ledger line, her stained fingertips resting quietly against the white damask of the tablecloth. Sebastian broke the seal with a sound that seemed to reverberate through the house, a sharp final crack that suggested something more than wax was being shattered. He spread the documents across the table with the scrupulous precision of an auditor. These were not mere letters or invitations, they were assignments of debt. For years, Sir Arthur had allowed the Sterling accounts to rot, hiding behind a facade of propriety while borrowing against the very stones of his house to fund Honoria's extravagances and Percival Vane's gambling habits. Sebastian's voice, when he finally spoke, was as cold and level as the winter sky. He explained, with the detachment of someone reading a weather report, that he had spent the last fortnight purchasing every outstanding note, every mortgage, and every vowel of indebtedness that bore the Sterling name. Honoria Sterling attempted to find her voice, her silk skirts rustling with a sound like dry leaves. She spoke of family ties, of the sanctity of their social standing, and of the inherent cruelty of a neighbor acting with such calculated aggression. Clara, expecting to find the same cowed creature who had once hidden in the shadows of a library. But Clara did not flinch. Sebastian ignored the interruption entirely. He turned the final page, a deed of absolute transfer, and slid the entire packet across the polished wood until it came to rest before Clara. He told her, in front of her father and the woman who had spent a decade calling her a drain on the world, that he had not bought these debts to enrich himself. He had bought them for her. The thick stillness was practically carnivorous, and it was currently sinking into the pride of the Sterlings. Clara Sterling was no longer a penniless daughter being bartered away. She was now the sole landlord of her father's house. The realization settled over the table like a heavy frost. Sebastian watched as Arthur Sterling's eyes darted toward the papers, realizing that every acre he walked upon now belonged to the child he had neglected. Sebastian remarked that a ledger was the only honest room in the world, and by his own scrupulous arithmetic, the Sterlings had been insolvent for a generation. He turned his attention to Honoria, his grey eyes showing the first flicker of a hard, righteous heat. He noted that she had frequently remarked upon Clara's lack of worth, yet it was Clara's secret management of the Sterling books. that had kept the bailiffs from their door for years. He suggested that it was a profound irony that the woman who considered herself the mistress of the county was now technically a guest on the sufferance of the girl she had deemed useless. The aftermath of the revelation was not marked by shouting, for Thorne Hall did not permit such vulgarity. It was marked by a chilling, absolute removal. Sebastian rose and gestured toward the door, his posture echoing the unyielding stone of the moor. He informed Honoria that her presence was no longer tolerated within the boundaries of his lands, nor would she be permitted to set foot upon the Sterling estate, which was now under the guardianship of Thorne Hall. Honoria attempted a final desperate appeal to propriety, her voice rising in a shrill vibrato as she claimed that Clara owed her a daughter's duty. Clara stood then, the old metal circle hanging heavy and cold at her waist. She did not raise her voice. She simply stated that duty was a debt that had been paid in full during the years she spent fixing the math of their betrayals. The Sterling carriage was brought round in the pouring rain, the horses' hooves splashing through the mud of the driveway. Sebastian stood on the portico, a tall silhouette in the gloom, watching as the people who had tried to sell Clara like a piece of livestock were forced to gather their belongings in disgrace. Honoria's departure was a frantic, undignified affair, her expensive pelisse dragging in the dirt as she realized the gates of society were closing behind her. Sebastian did not offer a hand to assist them. He remained a silent sentinel of justice. He waited until the carriage lamps faded into the grey mist of the evening before he turned to Clara, who was holding the heavy iron bolt of the front door. Clara stepped toward the great oak entrance, her movements deliberate and sure. She grasped the handle of the bolt, the very symbol of her own containment for so many years, and slid it home. The clack of the iron was the loudest sound in the house, a definitive, heavy punctuation mark at the end of a long and bitter chapter. As the bolt settled into its housing, the house itself seemed to change. The tension that had lived in the rafters for 7 years, the sense of a building holding its breath against the cold, finally dissolved. At long last, since Sebastian had been consumed by his desolate chill, Thorne Hall began to breathe. The air in the hallway felt lighter, scented no longer with the dust of the past, but with the faint thawing hope of a new season. Sebastian watched her from the shadows of the gallery, his stillness no longer a mask of pain, but a sign of profound respect. He saw her look at the keys, then at the locked door, and finally at the papers she still held in her hand. He observed the way she stood, not as a victim who had been rescued, but as a master who had reclaimed her own territory. He knew then that the girl he had found hiding in the dark had finally stepped into the light, and, in doing so, she had brought the light back to him. The numbers had been balanced, the debts had been cleared, and the silence of the house was no longer a grave, but a sanctuary. Being seen by the right person was not the danger. It was the only safety worth the name, and as Clara looked up to meet his eyes, the ice that had encased Sebastian's heart for 7 years began to melt into the warm, quiet certainty of belonging. The morning light at Thorne Hall did not arrive as a thief in the night, stealing warmth from the stone, but as a welcome guest. The estate, once a mausoleum of quiet desperation and unpaid debts, was now a living, breathing creature. Clara Sterling stepped onto the terrace, her boots clicking rhythmically against the slate. The sound was no longer a hollow echo, but a note of industry in a larger symphony. Far below, the grain mill hummed, a steady vibration signaling a harvest successfully managed and accounts finally settled. Sebastian Thorne followed her, his presence a steady anchor in the cool air. He had borne his suffering like an endless tempest for 7 years, a relentless, freezing storm that had finally broken, leaving behind a sky of clear grey. The silence between them had changed its character. It no longer threatened to bite. It was a space where understanding could rest without the need for performance. They walked together toward the gardens, where the scent of damp earth rose to meet them. Near the stone wall of the north wing, the sprig of dried lilac Clara had once found in his study had been replaced by a vibrant living bush. It was finally blooming, its clusters of pale purple heavy with dew. Clara reached out to touch a petal, her blackened fingertips, the mark of a night spent finalizing tenant leases, looking dark against the delicate bloom. Sebastian stopped beside her, his hands clasped behind his back in a familiar, stoic posture. He looked at the flowers, then at the woman who had coaxed them from a neglected corner of his soul. In the 7 years since his wife's death had taken his peace, he had viewed his world through the lens of scarcity. He had seen his house as a grave and himself as its keeper. Clara had looked at the same ruins and seen a ledger that simply required a more scrupulous hand. "The gardener tells me these will return every year now," the Duke remarked, his voice low and even. He said they only required the dead wood to be cleared away, so the new life could breathe. He turned his head, his grey eyes searching hers with a depth of recognition. "I find I was much like this garden, Miss Penhaligon, choked by what was already gone, unable to see the soil beneath the weeds." Clara did not look away. She had learned that Sebastian Thorne was an aristocrat who valued the architecture of a soul over the facade of a title. "The soil was always there, Your Grace. It merely required someone to calculate the cost of neglect and decide that the restoration was worth the labor. Calculations remain objective, though individuals frequently misrepresent their totals. The arithmetic of this estate was never a mystery to me. It was a promise." He stepped closer, the scent of bergamot and leather moving with him. "Honoria called you a drain on resources," he said, the memory of her stepmother's cruelty sounding absurd in the face of their current prosperity. She saw a broken chair where I saw the master of the house. On that first day in the library, when you were hiding from Lord Percival Vane, a man who sought to buy you like livestock. I wondered why a woman with such fire in her eyes would ever need to run. I was running because I had not yet realized that I carried the keys to my own sanctuary," Clara replied, her voice steady. "I thought competence was a burden I had to carry in secret. I did not know it could be the very thing that earned me my freedom." She looked over the estate, the sun catching the gold of the wheat. "I am no longer running, Sebastian. There is nowhere left to go that could possibly be better than a house that finally knows how to breathe." He reached into his pocket and produced the collection of skeleton keys. The heavy, cold ring he had handed her months ago when she was an impoverished gentlewoman with a sharp mind. But this time, he did not hand it to her as a master hands a tool to a servant. He held it in the palm of his hand, a weight they both shared. "I told your family you were exactly what I was looking for. I was more right than I knew. I was looking for a partner, a mind that could match my own, and a heart that was not afraid of the work." The library at Thorne Hall remained the heart of their shared world, but it was no longer a place of shadows. The afternoon sun poured through the high windows, illuminating the mahogany shelves and the scrupulous order Clara had brought to the volumes. Upon the massive desk lay a new document, the ink still fresh, a marriage contract that was also an intellectual partnership. It was a ledger of a different sort, where the assets were trust, respect, and a shared vision. Clara sat at the desk, the symbol of her authority resting beside her hand. She looked at the gilt-edged mirror above the fireplace. It was an honest, unforgiving sort of glass, and today it showed her a truth she no longer wished to avoid. She did not look like the discarded wallflower who had once mended linens in the dark. Her spine was straight, her gaze was clear, and her face held the calm authority of a woman who knew her own value to the last decimal point. Sebastian stood by the window, watching her. He did not need to speak to offer protection. His presence was a shield that had weathered the worst social storms. He had stood by her when the Sterlings had tried to reclaim her, and he had publicly declared her worth when the world saw only her lack of a dowry. "The contracts are ready for the final seal," Clara said, her voice echoing softly. She picked up the pen, her fingers moving with the precision of a master accountant. "The estate is solvent, the tenants are secure, and the debt of the past has been paid in full. We are starting the new year with a clean page." He walked to the desk and placed his hand over hers. The warmth of his skin was a final anchor. "It is a clean page," he agreed. "And we shall write it together, not as master and manager, but as two souls who found their way out of the dark by looking at the truth." Clara signed her name, the ink flowing smoothly. As she set the pen down, she realized the house was no longer holding its breath. The stones and the very air seemed to settle into a permanent peace. She was no longer the payment for a debt she did not owe. She was the savior of Thorne Hall, the mistress of its future, and the woman who had turned a mausoleum into a home. Sebastian leaned down, his forehead resting against hers for an intimate second. "You were never useless, Clara. he whispered, a final vindication. They were simply too blind to see the sun standing right in front of them. Outside, under the wide sky, the lilacs poured their scent over the warm, living house. The gates were locked against the cruelty of the past, and inside the fire was lit, the ledgers were balanced, and the heart of the Duke was finally at peace. Have you ever felt seen by the right person when the rest of the world was looking past you? Tell me where you are listening from tonight. Integrity is a currency that never loses its value. If this story touched you, leave a lilac in the comments. May your own house breathe with peace tonight. Good night from the fireside.